July 15, 1995, 2:17 p.m. The National Archives and Records Administration, College Park, Maryland. In the sterile, climate-controlled silence of the main research room, Dr. Evelyn Reed, a meticulous military historian from Georgetown University, carefully pried open the brittle manila folder of case file USM CCM 459812. Her fingers, stained faintly with archival dust, trembled as she handled the heavily redacted court-martial transcript. She was hunting for anomalies in Pacific War logistics, but what she found felt like touching a live wire, a story of impossible insubordination whose true nature had been buried under 50 years of government black ink, a secret radiating a cold, palpable gravity. Dr. Reed, a woman whose wire-rimmed glasses were perpetually perched on the end of her nose and who had a nervous habit of tapping her fountain pen against her teeth, wasn't one for wild speculation. But this was different. The transcript for Technical Sergeant Harlan M. Hayes, service number 385512, was almost entirely classified, citing the Espionage Act of 1917 for a simple insubordination charge. It made no sense. It was this discrepancy that sent her digging for 2 more hours into the newly declassified Office of Scientific Research and Development files. Cross-referencing Hayes's service number, she finally hit gold in NARA Record Group 227, file OSRDMJ77B, a technical summary authored by OSRD Director Vannevar Bush himself. The musty scent of aging paper filled her nostrils as she saw the 2 files, created 3,000 miles apart, connect across 5 decades. The OSRD file was the key that unlocked everything. It wasn't about logistics. It was about a ghost weapon, a program so secret it didn't officially exist, Project Mjolnir. Dr. Reed stared at the schematics for the M-1 Sonic Resonance Emitter, a 1.5-meter hexagonal dish composed of 12 magnetostrictive transducers, designed by an MIT physicist named Dr. Alistair Finch. The specifications were chillingly precise. Powered by 48 T23 silver zinc batteries, it projected a silent, focused 7 Hz infrasound wave with a peak output of 2.1 megawatts. The intended effect, as described in cold, clinical detail by Colonel Sterling Vance of the OSS, was catastrophic structural failure and, in human targets, resonant cavitation of internal organs. She could almost feel the low, unheard thrum of the weapon, a silent killer designed to leave no trace, a perfect weapon whose existence was now undeniable on the page in front of her. The file's context was a nightmare she knew all too well from her research. May 25, 1945, the Battle of Okinawa. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr.'s 10th Army was being bled white against Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima's 32nd Army, fighting for every inch of the Shuri Castle defensive line. The 77th Infantry Division was taking over 200 casualties a day, their flamethrowers and M4 Sherman tanks proving useless against the interlocking cave complexes. The air was thick, with the coppery smell of blood and the constant, deafening chatter of Nambu machine guns. In Washington, the casualty projections for the invasion of the mainland were hovering at nearly 1 million Americans. The pressure on the 5th Amphibious Corps to break the stalemate was immense, a crushing weight that made the unthinkable not just possible, but necessary. This was the world into which Technical Sergeant Harlan M. Hayes, a 24-year-old engineering prodigy from Purdue University, carried a weapon that could level a bunker without a sound. It was a weapon that could end the siege, save thousands of American lives, and win the battle in a single, silent instant. But he didn't use it. The question that screamed from the declassified pages was, American in a bike, 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 American in a bike. Why would a soldier refuse to deploy a war-winning weapon at the height of the bloodiest battle in the Pacific? Before I tell you how Sergeant Hayes and his 3-man team faced a choice that would rewrite the end of the war, comment below where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, You won't want to miss the story of Project Mjolnir. The strategic landscape of early 1945 was one of grim attrition. In Europe, the Allies were closing the vice on Nazi Germany, but in the Pacific, the war had entered its most savage phase. The island-hopping campaign, which began at Guadalcanal in August 1942, had cost the U.S. Marine Corps and Army hundreds of thousands of casualties. Iwo Jima, a volcanic rock just 8 square miles in size, had cost Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz's forces over 26,000 casualties, including nearly 7,000 dead, in just 36 days of fighting. The Japanese doctrine of no surrender, exemplified by General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's fanatical defense, meant that every yard of conquered ground was paid for in blood, a horrifying calculus that weighed heavily on military planners like General George C. Marshall back in Washington, D.C. This brutal reality was the fertile ground in which programs like Project Mjolnir were born. The Office of Scientific Research and Development, under the brilliant leadership of Vannevar Bush, had been established in 1941 with a singular mandate: to harness the full power of American science for the war effort. It was the OSRD that oversaw the Manhattan Project, but it also ran thousands of smaller, compartmentalized projects. Dr. Alistair Finch, a reclusive genius with a Ph.D. in applied acoustics from MIT, had first proposed the concept of a resonance weapon in a 1943 memorandum to the National Defense Research Committee. This theory, initially dismissed by 2 senior physicists, argued that a low-frequency, high-amplitude acoustic wave could be focused to devastating effect, a concept that sounded more like science fiction than practical weaponry. The project gained traction after a series of disturbing intelligence reports from the China-Burma-India theater. Reports compiled by Major General William Wild Bill Donovan's Office of Strategic Services detailed the incredible resilience of Japanese underground fortifications. These complexes, often dug deep into volcanic rock and reinforced with layers of palm logs and earth, could withstand direct hits from 500-pound bombs. For men like Colonel Sterling Vance, an unflappable Yale Law graduate in charge of the OSS Special Operations Branch, this wasn't just a tactical problem, it was a strategic crisis. The projected invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, would face millions of soldiers and civilians dug into just such defenses across the entire home islands. A new key was needed to unlock them. Finch's proposal, initially codenamed Project Jericho, was greenlit on May 10, 1944, with an initial budget of $2.2 million and the highest priority classification, designated, quote, ultrasonic. Finch, a man who habitually wore the same tweed jacket every day and subsisted on a diet of coffee and stale sandwiches, was given a soundproofed laboratory in MIT's legendary Building 20. He assembled a team of 15 physicists and engineers, including specialists from Bell Labs and the Naval Research Laboratory. Their primary challenge was developing a transducer material capable of handling the immense power required without shattering. The breakthrough came in September 1944 with the creation of a proprietary terphenol D-like alloy, which could convert massive electrical pulses into powerful acoustic waves with 92% efficiency. The human component was just as critical. Colonel Vance, a man known for his perfectly tailored uniforms and the ever-present scent of expensive cologne, understood that the weapon's greatest vulnerability was the people who operated it. He personally oversaw the recruitment of the operational team, seeking out individuals with a rare combination of technical brilliance and psychological fortitude. He found his lead technician in Harlan Hayes, a farm boy from Indiana, who had graduated top of his class from Purdue's electrical engineering program in 1942. Hayes's service file was a paradox. It praised his unmatched intuitive grasp of wave propagation, while also noting a rigid moral framework that Vance flagged as a potential command and control liability. The first full-scale prototype was ready for testing by early November 1944. The location chosen was Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, a desolate expanse of salt flats and barren mountains 85 miles southwest of Salt Lake City. Within the isolated confines of Range 5 Test Structure Gamma, Army engineers had constructed a perfect replica of a Japanese command bunker, complete with 3-foot-thick, non-rebar reinforced concrete walls. The entire test was to be conducted inside Building 7B, a massive anechoic chamber designed to absorb any sound or vibration, ensuring Project Mjolnir remained a complete ghost. The chill of the pre-dawn desert air on November 14, 1944, was thick with anticipation as the final countdown began. At precisely 4:30 Mountain War Time, the order was given. The M-1's capacitor bank, drawing power from 48 humming T-23 silver zinc batteries, took 90 seconds to reach its full 2.1 megawatt charge. From the observation booth, Dr. Finch and Colonel Vance watched on a closed-circuit display. There was no sound, no flash of light. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing seemed to happen. Then, the concrete walls of the target bunker began to tremble, not from an impact, but as if they were turning to liquid. Cracks spiderwebbed across the surface before the entire structure imploded into a pile of concrete dust and rubble. The test was a terrifying success. The operational doctrine for the M1 was codified in a document Vance himself authored, Protocol 734 Alpha. It was a masterpiece of compartmentalization. The 3-man deployment team would only be briefed on the weapon's full biological effects 24 hours before a mission. The activation itself required a dual-key system under Protocol Cerberus, where the commanding officer and the lead technician, Hayes, had to turn their keys simultaneously. This was meant to be a safeguard, but Vance secretly worried it was a critical flaw. He included a final, chilling directive, a 3-pound thermite self-destruct charge. Charge MSD-1 was to be activated if capture was imminent. The weapon and its operators were never to be taken alive. While Finch and Vance were perfecting their silent killer in the Utah desert, the war in the Pacific was reaching its crescendo. The liberation of the Philippines was underway, a bloody campaign that saw General Douglas MacArthur's forces fight house to house in the ruins of Manila. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, had been effectively annihilated at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, losing 4 aircraft carriers and 3 battleships, including the super battleship Musashi. But the Japanese army was proving to be a far more resilient and fanatical foe, digging in and preparing to defend their homeland to the last man, woman, and child. The strategic focus was now shifting to the islands that formed the final barrier to the Japanese mainland, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These islands were not just stepping stones, they were essential for Operation Downfall. Planners at the Pentagon, including Admiral Ernest J. King, needed their airfields to provide fighter cover for the B-29 Superfortress bombers that were beginning their firebombing campaign against Japanese cities. The pressure to seize these islands quickly and with minimal casualties was immense, creating a desperate appetite for any new technology, any miracle weapon that could break the impending stalemate. The decision to deploy the M1 to Okinawa was made on May 1, 1945, in a top-secret meeting at Pearl Harbor, attended by Admiral Nimitz and Lieutenant General Buckner. The 77th Infantry Division was stalled at the Shuri Line, and conventional tactics were failing. Aerial reconnaissance photos taken by the 306th Bombardment Group showed the primary target, Command Bunker 3, was the linchpin of the entire defensive network. General Buckner, a gruff, old-school commander who preferred leading from the front, reluctantly agreed to the deployment of the quote-quote special weapon, though he was only told it was a new form of quote-quote concussion ordnance. The true nature of Mjolnir was known to fewer than 50 people in the entire Allied war effort. The Mjolnir device and its 3-man team, led by Hayes, were flown from Utah to Hawaii, and then to a forward operating base on the island of Tinian, all under the cover of darkness. The equipment was shipped in crates marked Radio Sonde Weather Equipment, Priority Red, a designation so mundane it was the perfect camouflage. Colonel Vance's counterintelligence plan, Operation Echelon Blue, was already in effect, feeding false intelligence through double agents to the Japanese military intelligence agency, the Kempeitai. The disinformation hinted at new American liquid air explosives, a plausible explanation for any unusual structural damage that might be observed after the weapon's use. The psychological dimension of this secrecy cannot be overstated. The very concept of a weapon that killed with silent, invisible vibrations was so alien to 1940s military thinking that it provided its own layer of security. The Japanese High Command, men like General Korechika Anami, had no framework to comprehend such a technology. Even if a soldier survived an attack, their report of comrades dying instantly with no external wounds would likely be dismissed as combat fatigue or shell shock. The M1 was designed not just to destroy the enemy, but to be fundamentally incomprehensible to them, leaving behind a battlefield of inexplicable death and destruction. Harlan Hayes was the man at the center of this web of secrecy and terrifying technology. He wasn't a hardened combat veteran. He was a quiet, thoughtful engineer who still wrote to his parents in Indiana twice a week. He had been recruited by the OSRD directly from Purdue for his brilliant mind, spending 18 months in specialized training at the Naval Research Laboratory in D.C. and Dugway. He understood the physics of the M1 better than anyone, including, perhaps, Dr. Finch himself. He had seen what it did to concrete bunkers and, in classified animal trials, what it did to living tissue. The weight of that knowledge, a burden shared by only two other men on the entire island, settled on his 24-year-old shoulders like a physical shroud. By May 25, 1945, the situation on Okinawa had become apocalyptic. The relentless rain had turned the battlefield into a sea of mud, a landscape of shattered trees and water-filled shell craters that stank of death and decay. The 77th Infantry Division, under the command of Major General Andrew D. Bruce, had been fighting for control of the Shuri Highlands for 3 weeks. The casualty rate was unsustainable. Every cave, every pillbox, every burial tomb had been turned into a machine gun nest. The daily grind of flamethrowers, satchel charges, and bayonets was taking a horrific toll on the morale and manpower of the American forces. The order to deploy the M1 wasn't just a strategic decision, it felt like a last resort. The target, Command Bunker 3, was dug into the reverse slope of a ridge overlooking the city of Shuri. It was impervious to artillery fire from the 24th Corps, 155mm long tom guns, and too well defended for a direct infantry assault without catastrophic losses. Captain E.L. Peterson, the officer in charge of the Mjolnir team security detail, was a career soldier with a chest full of ribbons from the campaigns in the Aleutians and Leyte. He was a good officer, but he saw the world in terms of objectives and acceptable losses. He had been given a mission, clear Bunker 3, and he had been given a tool to do it. The complex ethical questions of this new weapon were an abstraction he couldn't afford to consider. The Japanese forces under Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima were equally desperate. Cut off from reinforcement or resupply, they had resolved to fight to the last man. Their ignorance of the M1 was absolute. Their entire defensive strategy was predicated on the known capabilities of American weaponry. They had calculated exactly how much concrete and earth was needed to withstand a 16-inch naval shell or a 2,000-pound bomb. The idea that a weapon could simply bypass these defenses to turn their fortifications into tombs without a sound was not a possibility they could have ever conceived. This fundamental blindness was the cornerstone of the M1's intended tactical advantage. Colonel Sterling Vance's security protocols were brutally effective. The Mjolnir team was isolated from other units, their special equipment kept under a 24-hour armed guard. Their cover story was that they were an experimental long-range radio relay team. This compartmentalization meant that even the G2 intelligence officers of the 5th Amphibious Corps didn't know the true nature of their mission. This extreme secrecy, while essential for security, also created a dangerous vacuum. The final decision to fire the weapon would fall to a handful of men on a remote ridge, far from the strategic oversight of the top brass. The M1's effects were deliberately engineered to be misidentified. Post-action analysis by an enemy observer would show a structure that had collapsed, as if from a massive internal explosion, but with no scorching, no shrapnel, and no chemical residue. In the chaos of the Okinawan battlefield, where thousands of tons of ordnance were falling every day, such an anomaly would be easily overlooked. Any reports of soldiers bleeding from their eyes and ears before dying would be attributed to the well-known effects of blast-induced barotrauma from conventional explosives. The weapon was a phantom, designed to leave behind only confusion and death. This multi-layered deception was so successful that for 50 years, not a single Japanese or American account of the Battle of Okinawa ever mentioned anything unusual about the assault on the Shuri Line, other than its horrific casualty count. There were no rumors of a death ray or a wonder weapon. The secret was kept not just by oaths and classified documents, but by a carefully constructed veil of physics and psychology. The enemy couldn't report what they didn't understand, and the few Americans who knew weren't talking. The three-man Mjolnir team set up their weapon on a muddy, rain-slicked ridge 150 meters from the entrance to Command Bunker 3. The air was heavy with the smell of ozone from the M1's power unit and the sweet, cloying scent of decaying vegetation. It took them 20 minutes to assemble the 1.5-meter dish and connect the heavy power cables from the T-23 battery stack. Harlan Hayes worked with a focused, almost mechanical precision, his hands steady, despite the tremor of exhaustion that ran through his body. He hadn't slept more than 3 hours in the last 2 days, sustained by lukewarm coffee and the adrenaline of the mission. Beside him, the other 2 members of his team, Corporal Miller and PFC Shaw, went through their checklist. They were technicians, not philosophers. They had been trained for months at WWII to assemble, arm, and maintain the M1. They trusted their commanding officer, Captain Peterson, and they trusted their lead technician, Sergeant Hayes. Their job was to follow orders. The moral calculus of their mission was not part of their training. They were simply cogs in a machine they didn't fully understand, focused on the immediate task of getting the strange silent weapon ready to fire. At 11:35 a.m. on May 25, 1945, everything was ready. The M1's hexagonal dish was aimed squarely at the camouflaged entrance to the bunker. Captain Peterson received the final go-ahead via his -300 Seychelles rupees walkie-talkie. The voice of his battalion commander was tinny and distorted by static, but the order was clear. Execute on your mark. End this thing. Peterson turned to Hayes, his face grim under his mud-streaked helmet. "Sergeant," he said, his voice low and steady, "it's time." But something had happened just minutes before. A forward scout from the 306th Infantry Regiment, a young private named O'Malley, had crawled close enough to the bunker's secondary ventilation shaft to hear something that wasn't in any intelligence report. It wasn't the sound of soldiers or military equipment. It was the sound of children crying. He relayed the information back, a frantic whisper over his own radio. The message reached Captain Peterson just as he was preparing to give the final order. The bunker wasn't just a command post. It was a civilian shelter. The intelligence was a game-changer. U.S. Army Civil Affairs teams had estimated that thousands of Okinawan civilians were caught in the crossfire, but specific locations were almost impossible to confirm. This report was different. It was direct first-hand observation. Post-battle analysis would later confirm that Command Bunker 3 was sheltering 877 Okinawan civilians, including an estimated 200 children from the Shuri Daiichi Primary School who had been moved there by the Japanese Army. They were all directly in the path of the M1's invisible, unstoppable wave of sonic destruction. Captain Peterson processed the new information for a split second. The pressure of the mission, the lives of his own men hanging in the balance, weighed against the new, horrifying report. He made a command decision. The civilians were a tragic consequence of war, but his orders were to take the bunker. He looked at Hayes, whose face had gone pale. "Sergeant," Peterson repeated, his voice harder now. "Prepare to activate. That's a direct order." He pulled out his own activation key, its brass surface gleaming in the dim light. This was the moment the entire project, from Dr. Finch's theories to Colonel Vance's protocols, had led to. The culmination of millions of dollars, thousands of hours of research, and the brightest minds in the country. The dual-key system, Protocol Cerberus, was designed as a failsafe, but it was now the fulcrum upon which thousands of lives rested. The system required 2 men to condemn the people in that cave. Captain Peterson was one. The other was Technical Sergeant Harlan M. Hayes. Hayes looked from the weapon to his captain, and then back towards the unseen bunker. He could almost hear the 7 Hz frequency in his mind, could visualize the resonant wave passing through the earth and concrete, could picture its effect on the soft tissues of the human body. He had seen the test results. He knew it would be instantaneous, silent, and absolute. And he knew it would make no distinction between a soldier and a child. He held his own activation key in his hand, its metal cool against his sweaty palm. At 11:40 a.m., Captain Peterson gave the final command. "Turn your key, Sergeant." Hayes didn't move. He simply shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "Sir," he said, his voice quiet but clear over the distant crump of mortars. "My training is to operate this weapon, not to use it on a schoolhouse." He placed his key back in his pocket. He refused the direct order. This single act of defiance, this resonance of conscience, sealed the fate of Project Mjolnir and his own military career. The immediate consequences were swift and severe. The mission was aborted. The M-1 was never fired in combat. Within hours, the entire team and their equipment were pulled from the front line, packed onto a transport plane, and flown back to Pearl Harbor under armed guard. Captain Peterson reported Hayes for gross insubordination in the face of the enemy, a charge that carried a potential death sentence in wartime. Project Mjolnir was permanently shelved by the OSRD on June 1, 1945, with a final memo from Vannevar Bush citing the unacceptable command and control liability demonstrated by the incident. The tactical result of Hayes's refusal was brutal. The 77th Infantry Division was forced to take Command Bunker 3 by conventional means. The subsequent assault, using a relentless combination of flamethrowers, white phosphorus, and satchel charges, lasted for 2 more days. It cost the division an estimated 650 casualties, men who were killed or wounded taking a position that could have been neutralized in 3 seconds. The weight of that knowledge, the lives of his fellow soldiers traded for the lives of the civilians, would be a burden Hayes would carry for the rest of his life. Harlan Hayes was arrested and flown to a secure facility for his court-martial. The proceedings were a closely guarded secret, held in a classified session with no public record. The judges were read in on the existence of the M-1, but the full details of the civilian presence were downplayed in the official testimony. On August 2, 1945, just 4 days before the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Technical Sergeant Harlan M. Hayes was found guilty. He was stripped of his rank, dishonorably discharged from the U.S. Marine Corps, and forced to sign a lifetime non-disclosure agreement, his heroism buried under layers of official secrecy. The weapon itself vanished. The single operational prototype was disassembled at a secure facility, its components either destroyed or repurposed for other classified projects. Dr. Alistair Finch's work on magnetostrictive transducers would secretly influence the U.S. Navy's post-war sonar development for its new class of nuclear submarines. But the name Mjolnir was scrubbed from all but the most highly classified records. For all intents and purposes, the silent weapon of Okinawa simply ceased to exist, a ghost that left no trace on the official histories of the war. The silence held for 50 years. The world celebrated the end of the war, rebuilt itself, and moved into the Cold War. The Battle of Okinawa was remembered for its ferocity and its staggering death toll, but the story of what asterisks didn't happen on that muddy ridge remained untold. The 877 civilians who survived in Bunker 3 never knew how close they came to silent annihilation. The veterans of the 77th Division never knew that a weapon existed that could have saved hundreds of their friends. The secret was kept perfectly, locked away in the classified archives of a nation grateful for its victory, but unwilling to examine all of its costs. Then came July 15, 1995. The end of the Cold War and the passage of time led President Bill Clinton to sign into law an executive order declassifying millions of pages of World War II-era documents under a 50-year rule. It was a bureaucratic act, an attempt at historical transparency. No one in the government knew that buried within that mountain of paper was the story of Project Mjolnir. The trigger for the revelation wasn't a whistleblower or a deathbed confession. It was the patient, methodical work of a single historian, Dr. Evelyn Reed, following a breadcrumb trail of redacted ink. Dr. Reed's discovery sent shockwaves through the historical community. Her initial paper, Project Mjolnir, America's Other Superweapon, published in the Asterisk Journal of Military History in 1997, was met with skepticism. It sounded too fantastic to be true. But the documents were undeniable. She had the schematics, the test fire results from Dugway Proving Ground, the operational orders, and the damning court-martial transcript of Harlan Hayes. She had connected the dots, and the picture that emerged was one that fundamentally challenged the established narrative of the war's end. The revelation forced a painful re-evaluation of the Pacific War. It proved that the atomic bomb was not the only weapon of mass destruction developed by the United States. It opened up a new chapter in the ethical debates surrounding the conduct of the war, raising questions about what other secret weapons programs might still be buried in the archives. For military ethicists, the story of Harlan Hayes became a powerful, real-world case study on the concept of lawful orders and the moral obligations of a soldier. This quiet act of defiance became a touchstone for a new generation of military leaders. The impact was felt most profoundly in two communities. For the surviving veterans of the 77th Infantry Division, the news was a complex and often painful revelation. Some felt a renewed sense of bitterness, wondering if their friends could have been saved. Others, however, came to see Hayes's action as a moment of profound moral courage. A petition started by veterans of the 306th Infantry to clear Hayes's name gathered thousands of signatures, a grassroots effort to right a 50-year-old wrong. In Okinawa, the story was received with a mixture of shock and profound gratitude. A delegation of survivors from the Shuri Daiichi Primary School, now elderly men and women, traveled to the United States to meet with Dr. Reed and to lobby on Hayes's behalf. Their tearful testimony before a congressional subcommittee provided the emotional weight that finally, the strategic landscape of early 1945 was one of grim, grinding attrition. In Europe, the Allies were closing the vice on Nazi Germany, but in the Pacific, the war had entered its most savage phase. The island-hopping campaign, which began at Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, had cost the U.S. Marine Corps and Army hundreds of thousands of casualties. Iwo Jima, a volcanic rock just 8 square miles in size, had cost Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz's forces over 26,000 casualties, including nearly 7,000 dead, in just 36 days of fighting. The Japanese doctrine of no surrender, exemplified by General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's fanatical defense, meant every yard was paid for in blood, a horrifying calculus that weighed heavily on military planners like General George C. Marshall back in Washington, D.C., the air thick with the sulfuric smell of volcanic earth and death. This brutal reality was the fertile ground in which programs like Project Mjolnir were born. The Office of Scientific Research and Development, under the brilliant leadership of Vannevar Bush, had been established by executive order on June 28, 1941, with a singular mandate: harness American science for the war effort. It was the OSRD that oversaw the Manhattan Project, but it also ran thousands of smaller, compartmentalized projects. Dr. Alistair Finch, a reclusive genius with a 1938 Ph.D. in applied acoustics from MIT, first proposed the concept of a resonance weapon in a 1943 memorandum to the National Defense Research Committee. His theory, initially dismissed by two senior physicists, argued that a low-frequency, high-amplitude acoustic wave could be focused to devastating effect, a concept that sounded more like science fiction than practical weaponry. Finch, a man who habitually wore the same frayed tweed jacket and subsisted on a diet of black coffee and stale sandwiches, worked tirelessly in his lab, the air a permanent mix of old paper and ozone. The project gained traction after a series of disturbing intelligence reports from the China-Burma-India theater in late 1943. Reports compiled by Major General William Wild Bill Donovan's Office of Strategic Services detailed the incredible resilience of Japanese underground fortifications. These complexes, often dug 50 feet deep into volcanic rock and reinforced with layers of palm logs and earth, could withstand direct hits from 500-pound bombs dropped by B-25 Mitchell bombers. For men like Colonel Sterling Vance, an unflappable Yale Law graduate in charge of the OSS Special Operations Branch, this wasn't just a tactical problem, it was a strategic crisis. The projected invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, would face millions of soldiers and civilians dug into just such defenses across the entire home islands. A new key was needed to unlock them, and Vance, a man known for his perfectly tailored uniforms and the ever-present scent of expensive cologne, was determined to find it, no matter the cost. Finch's proposal, initially codenamed Project Jericho, was greenlit on May 10, 1944, with an initial budget of $2.2 million and the highest priority classification, designated ultrasonic. Finch assembled a team of 15 physicists and engineers, including specialists from Bell Labs and the Naval Research Laboratory, inside MIT's legendary Building 20. Their primary challenge was developing a transducer material capable of handling the immense power required without shattering. The breakthrough came in September 1944 with a proprietary terphenol D-like alloy that converted massive electrical pulses into powerful acoustic waves. With 92% efficiency, the hum of the test equipment a constant promising thrum in the soundproofed lab. Colonel Vance, a man whose polished shoes never seemed to gather dust, understood that the weapon's greatest vulnerability was the people who operated it. He personally oversaw the recruitment of the three-man operational team, seeking a rare combination of technical brilliance and psychological fortitude. He found his lead technician in Harlan M. Hayes, a farm boy from Indiana who had graduated top of his class from Purdue's electrical engineering program in 1942. Hayes's service file, USMC Service Number 385512, was a paradox. It praised his unmatched intuitive grasp of wave propagation, while also noting a rigid moral framework that Vance flagged as a potential command and control liability. Hayes, quiet and unassuming, had a nervous habit of cleaning his glasses with a handkerchief when deep in thought, a small, human gesture in a world of terrifyingly inhuman technology. The first full-scale prototype was ready for testing by early November 1944. The location was Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, a desolate expanse of salt flats 85 miles southwest of Salt Lake City. Within the isolated confines of Range 5, Test Structure Gamma, Army engineers had constructed a perfect replica of a Japanese command bunker with 3-foot-thick, non-rebar reinforced concrete walls. The entire test was conducted inside Building 7B, a massive anechoic chamber designed to absorb any sound or vibration, ensuring Project Mjolnir remained a complete ghost. The chill of the pre-dawn desert air on November 14, 1944, was thick with anticipation as the final countdown began. The only sound the quiet clicks from the control panel operated by two technicians from the Naval Research Laboratory, Dr. Samuel Aronson and Mr. David Klein. At precisely 4:30 Mountain War time, the order was given. The M-1's capacitor bank, drawing power from 48 humming T-23 silver zinc batteries, took 90 seconds to reach its full 2.1 megawatt charge. From the observation booth, Dr. Alistair Finch and Colonel Vance watched on a closed-circuit display. There was no sound, no flash of light. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing seemed to happen. Then, the concrete walls of the target bunker began to tremble, not from an impact, but as if they were turning to liquid. Cracks spiderwebbed across the surface before the entire structure imploded into a pile of concrete dust and rubble. The test was a terrifying success, the silence of the weapon's effect more chilling than any explosion. The operational doctrine for the M1 was codified in a document Vance himself authored, Protocol 734 Alpha. It was a masterpiece of compartmentalization. The 3-man deployment team would only be briefed on the weapon's full biological effects 24 hours before a mission. The activation itself required a dual-key system under Protocol Cerberus, where the commanding officer and the lead technician, Hayes, had to turn their keys simultaneously. This was meant to be a safeguard, but Vance secretly worried it was a critical flaw. He included a final, chilling directive. A 3-pound thermite self-destruct charge MSD-1, was to be activated if capture was imminent. The weapon, and its operators, were never to be taken alive. While Finch and Vance were perfecting their silent killer in the Utah desert, the war in the Pacific was reaching its crescendo. The liberation of the Philippines was underway, a bloody campaign that saw General Douglas MacArthur's forces fight house to house in the ruins of Manila from February 3 to March 3, 1945. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, had been effectively annihilated at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, losing 4 aircraft carriers and 3 battleships, including the super battleship Comrade Musashi. But the Japanese army was proving to be a far more resilient and fanatical foe, digging in and preparing to defend their homeland to the last man, woman, and child, the air over the conquered islands a permanent haze of smoke and the coppery smell of blood. The strategic focus was now shifting to the islands that formed the final barrier to the Japanese mainland, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These islands were essential for Operation Downfall. Planners at the Pentagon, including Admiral Ernest J. King and General Hap Arnold, needed their airfields to provide P-51 Mustang fighter cover for the B-29 Super Fortress bombers that were beginning their firebombing campaign against 67 Japanese cities. The pressure to seize these islands quickly and with minimal casualties was immense, creating a desperate appetite for any new technology, any miracle weapon that could break the impending stalemate. The decision to deploy the M1 to Okinawa was made on May 1, 1945, in a top-secret meeting at Pearl Harbor, attended by Admiral Chester Nimitz and Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. The 77th Infantry Division was stalled at the Shuri Line, and conventional tactics were failing against the cave complexes. Aerial reconnaissance photos, taken by the 306th Bombardment Group, showed the primary target, Command Bunker 3, was the linchpin of the entire defensive network. General Buckner, a gruff old-school commander who preferred leading from the front, reluctantly agreed to the deployment of the special weapon, though he was only told it was a new form of The true nature of Mjolnir was known to fewer than 50 people in the entire Allied war effort. The Mjolnir device and its 3-man team, led by Hayes, were flown from Utah to a forward operating base on the island of Tinian, all under the cover of darkness, between May 15 and May 18, 1945. The equipment, weighing over 200 pounds, was shipped in 4 heavy crates marked Radio Sonde Weather Equipment, Priority Red, a designation so mundane it was the perfect camouflage. Colonel Vance's counterintelligence plan, Operation Echelon Blue, was already in effect, feeding false intelligence through double agents to the Japanese military intelligence agency, the Kempeitai. The disinformation, crafted by Vance and Major Robert Peterson of the OSS, hinted at new American liquid air explosives, a plausible explanation for any unusual structural damage that might be observed after the weapon's use. The drone of the C-47 Skytrain's dual Pratt & Whitney R-1830 engines was a constant companion for the 18-hour flight. The psychological dimension of this secrecy cannot be overstated. The very concept of a weapon that killed with silent, invisible vibrations was so alien to 1940s military thinking that it provided its own layer of security. The Japanese High Command, men like General Korechika Anami, had no framework to comprehend such a technology. Their intelligence focused on conventional threats, shell calibers, bomb yields, and troop numbers. Even if a soldier survived an attack, their report of comrades dying instantly with no external wounds would likely be dismissed by field commanders like Colonel Hiromichi Yahara as combat fatigue or shell shock. The M-1 was designed not just to destroy the enemy, but to be fundamentally incomprehensible to them. Harlan Hayes was the man at the center of this web of secrecy. He wasn't a hardened combat veteran. He was a quiet, thoughtful engineer who still wrote to his parents in Indiana twice a week. He had been recruited by the OSRD directly from Purdue, spending 18 months in specialized training at the Naval Research Laboratory in D.C. and Dugway. He understood the physics of the M1 better than anyone, including, perhaps, Dr. Finch himself. He had seen what it did to concrete bunkers, and in classified animal trials conducted on January 12, 1945, what its 7 Hz frequency did to living tissue. The weight of that knowledge, a burden shared by only 2 other men on the entire island, settled on his 24-year-old shoulders like a physical shroud, the smell of ozone from the capacitor banks forever etched in his memory. By May 25, 1945, the situation on Okinawa had become apocalyptic. The relentless rain had turned the battlefield into a sea of mud, a landscape of shattered trees and water-filled shell craters that stank of death and decay. The 77th Infantry Division, under the command of Major General Andrew D. Bruce, had been fighting for control of the Shuri Highlands for 3 brutal weeks, losing over 4,000 men. The casualty rate was unsustainable. Every cave, every pillbox, every ancient burial tomb had been turned into a machine gun nest by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima's 32nd Army. The daily grind of M2 flamethrowers, 20-pound satchel charges, and bayonets was taking a horrific toll on the morale and manpower of the American forces. The order to deploy the M1 wasn't just a strategic decision. It felt like a last, desperate resort. The entire secret began in the quiet, chalk-dusted halls of MIT's Building 20. On May 10, 1944, OSRD Director Vannevar Bush officially approved Project Mjolnir with an initial budget of $2.2 million. The project was handed to Dr. Alistair Finch, a man whose brilliance was matched only by his social awkwardness. Working with his lead engineer, Dr. Samuel Aronson from Bell Labs, Finch spent the first 60 days just trying to solve the primary power-to-transducer problem. The air in his lab was a constant mixture of stale coffee, ozone, and the faint, sweet smell of overheating vacuum tubes. Finch's team of 15 physicists, handpicked from the Naval Research Laboratory and Caltech, worked in 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. The central challenge was the transducer material itself. Standard piezoelectric crystals would shatter under the required 2.1 megawatt load. The breakthrough came on September 3, 1944, when a young metallurgist, Drive, Miriam Hale, perfected a proprietary terphenol D-like alloy. This new material could convert the massive electrical pulses from the capacitor bank into powerful 7 Hz acoustic waves with an astonishing 92% efficiency. The low, constant hum of the prototype's power converters became the heartbeat of the entire project, a sound that promised a terrible new form of victory. While Dr. Finch perfected the science, Colonel Sterling Vance of the OSS was building a cage of secrecy around it. From his sterile 4th-floor office in Washington, D.C., he authored Protocol 734 Alpha, a 112-page security doctrine that governed every aspect of the project. He personally vetted over 200 candidates for the three-man operational team, his eyes scanning their psychological profiles for any hint of instability. On October 21, 1944, he selected Technical Sergeant Harlan M. Hayes, noting his Purdue engineering degree and his unmatched intuitive grasp of wave propagation. But he also made a red ink notation next to a comment from Hayes's boot camp psychiatrist. Subject possesses a rigid, almost inflexible moral framework. The weight of the heavy, top-secret stamp on Hayes's file felt palpable in Vance's hands. By mid-October 1944, the project moved from the theoretical to the practical. The 509th Composite Group's Engineering Battalion, the same unit that would later support the atomic bomb missions, was tasked with constructing test structure Gamma at Dugway Proving Ground. Under the guise of a meteorological research station, they built a perfect replica of a Japanese command bunker with 3-foot-thick, non-rebar reinforced concrete walls. The site was 85 miles from Salt Lake City, a desolate expanse where the cold, dry wind carried the scent of salt and dust, and the only observers were the armed guards patrolling the 10-mile perimeter. The prototype M1 unit, designated XM1001, arrived at Dugway on November 1, 1944, shipped in 4 heavy crates marked Seismic Survey Equipment. It was here that Harlan Hayes, along with Corporal Miller and PFC Shaw, first laid hands on the weapon they were to master. For 13 grueling days they trained in 18-hour sessions inside the cavernous, windowless building 7B. They memorized the 12-step assembly process and drilled the 90-second charging sequence for the 48 T23 silver-zinc batteries until they could do it in complete darkness. The air inside the anechoic chamber was dead and still, thick with the metallic tang of the batteries and the sweat of their exhaustion. The final proof-of-concept test took place in the pre-dawn chill of November 14, 1944. At precisely 4:30 Mountain War Time, from a reinforced observation booth 200 meters away, Dr. Finch and Colonel Vance gave the go-ahead. Hayes initiated the 90-second charge sequence. On the closed-circuit display, they watched the target bunker. There was no explosion, no flash. Just an agonizing 3-second silence. Then, the entire concrete structure seemed to ripple before imploding into a cloud of fine dust. The only physical sensation was a deep, unsettling thrum that came up through the soles of their boots, a vibration that wasn't quite a sound. On an oscilloscope, Model 5 CP1, a single perfect resonance spike confirmed the weapon's terrifying success. Vance felt a cold knot of certainty in his stomach. He now possessed a weapon that could turn fortresses to dust. In the hours after the test, a team led by Dr. Finch and an OSRD geologist, Dr. Arthur Pembroke, examined the rubble. Their instruments registered no heat signature, no blast residue, no chemical traces. The concrete had been pulverized into a powder fine enough to sift through their gloved fingers. Dr. Pembroke's official report, filed on November 16, 1944, described the effect as flawlessly catastrophic structural resonance, a clinical phrase that did little to capture the chilling reality. The test's success was absolute, and it immediately triggered the project's transition from experimental to operational status, with a new budget allocation of $1.5 million for field deployment preparations. Colonel Vance immediately finalized the operational protocols. His concern about Hayes's moral framework led directly to the creation of Protocol Cerberus, the dual-key activation system. It was a safeguard he hoped would never be tested. On December 5, 1944, Vance flew to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, to give a personal briefing on Mjolnir's progress to General Leslie Groves, head of the Manhattan Project. Groves, a man accustomed to world-altering weapons, was reportedly unsettled by the M1's unconventional kill mechanism. It was in this meeting that Vance also secured $50,000 in discretionary funds to launch Operation Echelon Blue, the disinformation campaign that would feed false intelligence to the Japanese Kempeitai, about non-existent liquid air explosives. The weapon's biological effects, however, remain the project's darkest secret. On January 12, 1945, a series of classified animal trials were conducted in Chamber 4 at WWII, overseen by Major Charles Grant of the Army Medical Corps. The 7 Hz wave was tested on large mammals at a range of 150 meters. The results were so horrific that the full 28-page report was classified ultrasonic eyes only, accessible to only 4 men: Vance, Finch, Bush, and President Roosevelt. The clinical report noted total resonant cavitation of internal organs and instantaneous central nervous system collapse within 1.5 seconds of exposure. The silence of the test chamber was absolute, as Major Grant, his face a grim, emotionless mask, logged the results that proved the M1 was a perfect, traceless killer of men. On February 1, 1945, the weapon was officially declared combat-ready. The final M1 unit, serial number XM1001, was certified for deployment. Dr. Alistair Finch signed off on the final technical certification, his signature a shaky, almost illegible scrawl on the form. Colonel Vance filed the final security report, sealing the project's development history. The ghost weapon, born in an MIT lab and proven in the Utah desert, was now a reality, a silent, invisible monster waiting for a battlefield and the moral calculus of the men who would wield it. On May 22, 1945, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, the brilliant senior staff officer of the Japanese 32nd Army, felt the damp chill of the command bunker beneath Shuri Castle seep into his bones. Spreading a map across a makeshift table, he reviewed the defensive dispositions for the 4th time in 24 hours. His entire strategy, a masterful web of interlocking caves and reverse-slope defenses, was predicated on the known capabilities of American weaponry. He had calculated the blast radius of a 16-inch naval shell and the penetration depth of a 2,000-pound bomb. There was simply no category in his military calculus, no space on his map, for a weapon that could turn his fortresses to dust without a sound. This strategic blindness wasn't an accident. It was an architectural masterpiece of deception engineered 8,000 miles away by Colonel Sterling Vance. His Operation Echelon Blue, active since January 1945, was a symphony of misinformation. Through 2 double agents within the Japanese diplomatic corps in Portugal, codenamed Lark and Finch, the OSS had been feeding the Kempeitai a steady stream of plausible but entirely false intelligence. Reports detailed a new American liquid air explosive, a volatile ordnance that supposedly left behind no chemical residue. This narrative, crafted by Vance and Major Robert Peterson of the OSS, was designed to provide a ready-made, incorrect explanation for the M1's effects, ensuring the true secret would be lost in the fog of war. The physical secrecy on Okinawa was just as meticulous. The Mjolnir team, consisting of Technical Sergeant Harlan Hayes, Corporal Miller, and PFC Shaw, arrived on the island on May 18, 1945, and was immediately segregated at a remote position designated Camp 7, located 2 miles behind the 77th Division's main lines. Their 4 heavy crates, marked Radio Sonde Weather Equipment, drew no special attention. Hayes, a man whose quiet intensity was a stark contrast to the chaos around him, established a rigid, daily routine. At 0600 hours sharp, regardless of the rain or nearby artillery, he would uncase the M1's 1.5-meter hexagonal dish and meticulously clean its focusing lens with a chamois cloth, a habit from his days working in Purdue's optics lab. The air in their damp canvas tent was a constant mix of gun oil, ozone from the battery chargers, and the earthy smell of the Okinawan mud. The enemy wasn't entirely deaf, just deafened by the noise of conventional war. At 2:17 a.m. on May 23rd, a listening post operator near the Shuri line, Sergeant Kenji Tanaka of the 24th Division, noted an unusual steady hum on his Type 92 seismic detectors. The low-frequency vibration, hovering just below 10 Hz, was unlike the sporadic rumble of tanks or landing craft. He logged the anomaly in his report, but his superior, Captain Ito, dismissed it less than 30 minutes later as ambient engine noise from the hundreds of American LSTs and supply ships anchored in Hagushi Bay, 9 miles away. The ghost's whisper had been heard, but not understood. The secret was kept just as tightly on the American side. Captain E.L. Peterson, the Mjolnir team's security CO, was a career soldier with a chest full of ribbons from the campaigns in the Aleutians and Leyte. On May 24th, he briefed his 12-man Marine Guard detail, telling them their sole job was to protect an, quote, experimental long-range radio relay. None of them knew the truth. Peterson, a man who constantly chewed on unlit cigars, a nervous tic he'd developed on Guadalcanal, trusted Colonel Vance's protocols implicitly. He saw the world in terms of objectives and acceptable losses, and Protocol 734 Alpha was his Bible. His men were there to protect a black box, and that was all they needed to know. The psychological blindness of the Japanese command was the M1's greatest shield. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima and his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, were brilliant, battle-hardened tacticians, but their worldview was limited by their experience with conventional warfare. Their entire defensive strategy for the Shuri Line, finalized in a staff meeting on May 10, 1945, involved a network of over 60 miles of tunnels designed to withstand 16-inch naval shells and 2,000-pound blockbuster bombs. Their intelligence, based on frontline reports from the 62nd Division, focused entirely on American troop numbers and artillery calibers, leaving them utterly blind to an asymmetrical threat like the M1. The constant, damp chill of their command bunker under Shuri Castle was a testament to their unwavering faith in concrete and earth, a faith that was about to be rendered obsolete by a weapon that didn't care about thickness, only frequency. Even the weapon's aftermath was designed to be a lie. A top-secret memo from Colonel Vance to General Buckner's G3 operations chief, dated May 5, 1945, outlined the post-strike deception plan. Within 60 seconds of the M1's activation, a flight of 4 B-25 Mitchell bombers from the 499th Bomb Squadron, flying out of Yonton Airfield, would drop dummy 1,000-pound bombs, filled with sand, and a small smoke charge near the target. This would create the sound, fury, and visual signature of a conventional airstrike, completely masking the M1's silent, invisible, and far more terrible operation. The enemy would see an explosion and assume that was the cause of the destruction. On the rainy afternoon of May 24th, Hayes, Miller, and Shaw conducted their final systems check. They ran a low-power diagnostic on the M1's capacitor bank, drawing only 15 kilowatts, less than 1% of its full capacity. The low, resonant hum was barely audible over the drumming of rain on the tent canvas. Hayes, the Purdue engineering prodigy who once dreamed of designing municipal power grids, now meticulously checked the terminals on the 48 T23 silver zinc batteries, the faint, acrid smell of the electrolyte stinging his nostrils. His focus was absolute, a mental wall he built to separate the elegant physics of the machine from the horrific purpose for which it was built. He was a technician, and this was his job. The Japanese intelligence failure was systemic and profound. The Kempeitai, Japan's dreaded military police, did have a file on Dr. Alistair Finch from his pre-war academic work, but it labeled him a, quote, theoretical acoustician of no military significance. More telling was an intercepted cable from the Japanese embassy in Switzerland, dated January 1945. The cable mentioned Allied rumors of an American earthquake bomb, but this was misattributed by analysts in Tokyo to the 12,000-pound tallboy bombs being used against German U-boat pens in Europe. This misinterpretation, reviewed and signed off on by Major General Takeo Iwakuro of the Imperial General Headquarters, sent Japanese military scientists down a completely wrong path, focusing their limited resources on seismological warfare instead of acoustics. The quiet rustle of that misinterpreted file in Iwakuro's Tokyo office was the sound of a fatal, strategic miscalculation. The human cost of this ignorance was captured in a small, mud-stained diary found after the battle. It belonged to Private Goro Adachi of the Japanese 24th Division, stationed inside a secondary bunker near the Shuri line. His last entry, dated May 24, 1945, spoke of the absolute impregnability of their caves. "The Americans waste their shells," he wrote. "We are safe deep in the heart of the island. Not even their demons' biggest guns can touch us here." This misplaced confidence, shared by thousands of his comrades, was precisely the psychological vulnerability the M1 was designed to exploit and shatter. That evening, at 2000 hours, the reality of the weapon was made plain to its operators. In the dim, flickering light of a single lantern, Captain Peterson briefed Hayes, Miller, and Shaw on its full biological effects, as mandated by Protocol 734 Alpha. He read from a classified medical report, his voice flat and detached as he described total resonant cavitation of soft tissues and instantaneous central nervous system collapse. The air in the tent grew heavy and cold. Corporal Miller, a former auto mechanic from Detroit who had enlisted in 1942, looked physically ill. Hayes didn't react. He just stared at the schematic of the M1's 1.5-meter hexagonal dish taped to the inside of a footlocker, his mind tracing the path of the invisible 7 Hz wave. Meanwhile, General Ushijima was making a fateful decision. In his final staff meeting on the evening of May 24th, convinced the main American assault would come directly against the Shuri Heights, he ordered 2 full brigades, the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade and the 24th Division, to move from reserve positions and pack into the forward bunkers of the Shuri line. This concentration of nearly 8,000 troops into the very fortifications targeted by Mjolnir was a tragic irony. Ushijima, a traditionalist who believed in the supremacy of the samurai spirit, filled his command post with the smell of green tea and cigarette smoke as he and Colonel Yahara finalized the troop movements, completely unaware they were marching thousands of their men into a potential silent graveyard. The weapon's design was the final layer of deception. The M1's power unit, a stack of humming converters and capacitors, emitted a low-frequency vibration that was almost identical to the seismic signature of a standard U.S. Army 60-kilowatt diesel generator. With over 200 of these generators operating on the island to power command posts, hospitals, and airfields, the M1's operational hum would be just one more piece of background noise, completely lost in the cacophony of the American military machine. It was designed to hide in plain sight, a phantom in the orchestra of war. As dawn broke pale and gray on May 25, 1945, Japanese lookouts on Shuri Ridge saw the small American team setting up what looked like a large, strange radio antenna 150 meters from Command Bunker 3. A report was called in to Lieutenant Commander Sanagi, a naval officer coordinating the 32nd Army's artillery, but he deemed the 3-man team a low-priority target. He ordered his 150 mm guns to continue their barrage on an American M4 Sherman tank column advancing 800 meters to the east. This single, logical decision, based on the perfect visual deception of the M1's dish, guaranteed the initial safety of Hayes's team. It was the perfect storm of secrecy. Colonel Vance's multi-layered plan had worked flawlessly. Operation Echelon Blue provided a false narrative for any survivors. The weapon's technical profile provided acoustic and visual camouflage. Extreme compartmentalization blinded even friendly forces, and the enemy's own doctrinal rigidity prevented them from ever imagining such a threat could exist. As Hayes and his team made the final connections to the M1's 2.1 megawatt power source, the Japanese soldiers and Okinawan civilians inside Command Bunker 3, fewer than 2 football fields away, began their day, completely oblivious to the silent, invisible apocalypse being aimed at their door. The air was thick with the familiar smell of rain and mud, a normal morning in a war that was, for a few terrifying moments, on the verge of becoming something new and monstrous. The shelving of Project Mjolnir on June 1, 1945 was as silent as the weapon itself. In a top-secret memo to OSRD Director Vannevar Bush, Colonel Sterling Vance declared the project an, quote, unacceptable command and control liability. For Dr. Alistair Finch, the news was a crushing professional blow. His world-changing invention was now a ghost, locked away in a file cabinet. The sterile quiet of his MIT lab, once filled with the hum of creation, now felt like a tomb, thick with the cold, metallic scent of failure and the weight of 650 American lives lost in the conventional assault Hayes's refusal had necessitated. But a weapons technology, once born, is hard to kill. Even as Hayes's court-martial was being prepared, a different crisis was unfolding. In the North Atlantic, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz had unleashed his new Type 21 electroboot U-boats, submarines so quiet they could evade the Allies, existing QCS sonar systems with 80% success. On June 15, 1945, Dr. Philip M. Morse, head of the Navy's Anti-Submarine Warfare Operations Research Group, ASWORG, issued a desperate plea for a technological breakthrough. Dr. Finch, a man haunted by what his weapon was designed to do to people, saw a chance for redemption. He drafted a 12-page proposal to adapt the Mjolnir transducers for a new, powerful, low-frequency active sonar, a tool not for killing soldiers, but for hunting these silent steel sharks that were still bleeding Allied shipping dry. Colonel Vance saw Finch's proposal not as a redemption, but as the perfect tomb for Mjolnir's secret. He immediately championed the idea, working with Admiral Ernest J. King's office to create a new, deeply classified Navy program, Project Orca. On June 20, 1945, he retasked two of Mjolnir's top engineers from Bell Labs, Dr. Walter H. Brattain and a young Dr. John Bardeen, to work with Finch. Their mission: create a sub-oceanic low-frequency emitter, SOLF, based on the Mjolnir transducers. The goal was to build a system that could detect the new rubber-coated Type 21 U-boats at a range of over 5,000 yards, more than double the 200-yard effective range of the current fleet sonar. The entire project was moved to the Naval Undersea Warfare Center in New London, Connecticut, where the dusty, ozone-filled air of the Utah test site was replaced by the sharp, invigorating scent of salt water and diesel fuel from the nearby submarine pens. The breakthrough came with astonishing speed. Fueled by Finch's 20-hour workdays and the Navy's unlimited resources, a prototype SOLF unit was ready in less than a month. On July 10, 1945, Finch, his tweed jacket stained with grease and coffee, personally oversaw the installation of the system, now designated ANSQS-4, onto the destroyer escort U.S. England at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The urgency was palpable. Every 24 hours, another two Allied ships were being lost in the Atlantic. The frantic clatter of tools and the hiss of welding torches echoed through the shipyard day and night. The first full-power sea trial on July 15, 1945, was a revelation. In the choppy waters off the coast of New London, the ANSQS-4, emitting a low, powerful 12 Hz ping, detected a submerged U.S. training submarine, the USS Torsk *, at a staggering range of 7,200 yards. The sonar operator, Petty Officer James Caldwell, reported a return signal so clear he could hear the distinct cavitation of the submarine's screws, a level of acoustic detail that was previously science fiction. Observing the trials for the Bureau of Ordnance was Captain Arleigh Burke, who, within 30 minutes of the test's conclusion, sent a coded flash message to Admiral King recommending the immediate production of 50 units. The technology of Mjolnir, born to shatter bunkers, had just been reborn to guard the seas. The German Kriegsmarine never saw it coming. Their entire late-war naval strategy, crafted by Donitz himself, was predicated on the acoustic stealth of the 118 new Type 21 U-boats. German naval intelligence, the *B Dienst, had no sources within the OSRD and no inkling of Project Orca. By August 1, 1945, the first 3 U.S. destroyer hunter-killer groups, equipped with the brand-new ANSQS-4, were deployed to the North Atlantic as part of the reinforced Operation Teardrop 2, their sole mission to hunt these silent killers before they could reach American shores. The results were immediate and devastating. On August 6, 1945, the very same day the asterisk Enola Gay was dropping its atomic payload on Hiroshima, the destroyer U.S. Bora, part of Task Group 22.5, led by Captain John R. Rusenberger, acquired a firm SOLF contact at 100 yards. The target was U-1231, a Type IXC-40 boat commanded by Captain Lieutenant Herman Lessing. For 4 agonizing hours, Lessing performed every evasive maneuver he knew, diving to a depth of 220 meters, but the new American sonar held him in a terrifyingly precise grip. The Bora dropped a single pattern of 13 Mark 9 depth charges, their concussive blasts echoing through the cold Atlantic depths. Debris and a massive oil slick confirmed the kill 20 minutes later. In the final weeks of the war, Project Orca was directly credited with the sinking of 4 Type 21 boats, saving an estimated 500 Allied sailors and over 100,000 tons of vital war material. The low hum of Finch's transducer, once aimed at a bunker full of people, had brought a new, decisive, and silent victory. While Project Orca was winning a secret war, Colonel Vance was ensuring the First War remained buried forever. He used the stunning success of the new sonar system as the final justification to erase its origins. On August 10, 1945, at the secluded OSS Records facility at Fort Hunt, Virginia, he personally supervised the incineration of all but 2 master copies of the Mjolnir operational files. Standing by the furnace, the intense heat on his face, he watched the schematics and test results turn to ash, the acrid smoke of burning secrets rising into the humid Virginia air. The war ended, but the technology's secret evolution continued. On October 27, 1945, Dr. Alistair Finch, now a celebrated hero within the Naval Research Laboratory, quietly received the Navy Distinguished Civilian Service Award from Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal in a small private ceremony. He never once spoke of Okinawa, or the weapon's original name. His work on the ANSQS-4 became the bedrock of all post-war American submarine detection systems for the next 30 years. The terrible legacy of Mjolnir, a weapon whose use had been stopped by a single soldier's conscience, was successfully laundered into a tool of national defense, its dark and bloody origins known only to a handful of men like Vance and Finch, who would carry that silent burden to their graves. The strategic impact of this secret evolution was incalculable. While the world remained fixated on the atom bomb as the war's ultimate superweapon, this silent revolution in undersea warfare went completely unnoticed. It guaranteed American naval supremacy for the next 3 decades of the Cold War. The Soviet Union, which had captured several Type 21 U-boats and based its new Whiskey-class submarines on their stealthy design, was suddenly and inexplicably facing a U.S. Navy that could detect them from miles away. This massive technological gap, born from the repurposed heart of a weapon that was never fired, was a direct, unseen consequence of Harlan Hayes' single act of defiance on a muddy hill in Okinawa. The resonance of his conscience didn't just save 877 lives that day. It unknowingly reshaped the entire strategic balance of the world for the next 50 years. For 50 years, the secret held. It survived the end of the war, the dawn of the atomic age, and the entirety of the Cold War, a ghost story locked away in the steel cabinets of a nation's memory. Then came the steady, patient work of a single historian. On July 15, 1995, in the climate-controlled silence of the National Archives, Dr. Evelyn Reed, her wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose, felt the brittle paper of file USM CCM 459812 crackle under her touch. The name Harlan M. Hayes and the heavily redacted insubordination charge felt wrong. It was a gut feeling, the kind that had led her to her 2 previous book deals, a sense of a story screaming from behind the black ink. That feeling drove her for 2 more hours, the musty scent of aging paper and archival dust filling her nostrils, until she found the key in NERA Record Group 227. File OSRDMJ77B, authored by OSRD Director Vannevar Bush himself on June 1, 1945, was the Rosetta Stone. She spread its 28 pages on the table, her heart pounding a heavy, slow rhythm. The schematics for the M-1 Sonic Resonance Emitter were chillingly elegant. A 1.5-meter hexagonal dish, 12 magnetostrictive transducers, made of a proprietary alloy, a 2.1 megawatt peak output. Dr. Reed, a woman who understood the physics of war, felt a cold dread as she read the name of its creator, Dr. Alistair Finch, and the weapon's intended effect: catastrophic structural failure at a precise 7 Hz frequency. This wasn't a weapon. It was an instrument of impossible, silent destruction. The 2 files, born 3,000 miles and 2 government agencies apart, snapped together across 5 decades with the force of a thunderclap. The name Hayes HM Tech SGT was listed in the OSRD file as the project's lead field technician, right next to a single, damning sentence. Project terminated due to command and control liability during the Okinawa incident. Dr. Reed leaned back in her chair, the hard wood pressing into her spine, the quiet hum of the archive's HVAC system suddenly deafening. The story wasn't about insubordination. It was about a secret superweapon. This entire discovery was only possible because of President Bill Clinton's Executive Order 12,958, which had triggered the declassification of over 1.2 billion pages of documents. A skeptical colleague, Dr. Marcus Thorne from the Army War College, had called it a bureaucratic paper-pushing exercise. But he was wrong. It was a key, and Dr. Reed had just used it to unlock a door that had been sealed for half a century. The discovery consumed the next 18 months of Dr. Reed's life. Her Georgetown office became a chaotic command center, the walls covered in timelines and cross-referenced file numbers, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and old books. She collaborated with a university physicist, Dr. Lawrence Chen, who confirmed that the M1's specifications, particularly the use of a terphenol D-like alloy for the transducers, were not only viable, but decades ahead of their time. The quiet, steady click of her keyboard, as she typed her manuscript late into the night, felt like an answer to the silent, terrible weapon she was uncovering, a methodical reconstruction of a secret, designed by men like Colonel Sterling Vance, to be utterly erased. In the spring of 1997, her paper, Project Mjolnir, America's Other Superweapon, landed on the desk of Dr. Helen Shaw, the editor of the ** Journal of Military History. The initial peer review was brutal. 2 of the 3 anonymous reviewers dismissed it as well-researched speculation. It wasn't until Dr. Reed couriered certified copies of the NARE files, the schematic signed by Dr. Alistair Finch, the Dugway test results from November 14, 1944, and the termination order bearing Colonel Vance's crisp signature, that the tide turned. Dr. Shaw called her personally on May 2, 1997, her voice full of awe. "Dr. Reed," she said, "you haven't just found a footnote. You've found a whole new chapter." The feel of the first off-print, the ink still smelling fresh, was a moment of profound, world-altering validation. The journal's publication in August 1997 sent a seismic shock through the historical community. It wasn't a footnote. It was a tectonic shift that cracked the very foundations of the accepted narrative of the war's end. The story was picked up by the * New York Times in a front-page article on August 2nd, authored by journalist Thomas Ricks, forcing the Pentagon to issue a terse no comment. Prominent historians like Stephen Ambrose and David McCullough were compelled to acknowledge the discovery, admitting that it fundamentally changed the understanding of the ethical and technological dilemmas facing the American High Command in 1945. Suddenly, the atomic bomb wasn't the only terrible choice on the table. The quiet, academic world of military history was suddenly alive, with the frantic ringing of phones and the urgent hum of fax machines, as researchers scrambled to re-examine thousands of other newly declassified OSRD files, hunting for more ghosts. The story's resonance, however, was felt most deeply not in university halls, but in quiet suburban homes across America. When an excerpt of Dr. Reed's article was published in The Liberty Bell Ringer, the newsletter for the 77th Infantry Division Association, it was like a grenade had been rolled into a reunion. For the surviving veterans, now in their late 70s, it brought a flood of complex emotions: anger at the secret, grief for the 650 friends they'd lost taking Bunker 3, and a slow dawning and profound respect for the 24-year-old sergeant who had made an impossible choice they never knew about. The ripples crossed the Pacific. On October 11, 1997, the Japanese broadcaster NHK aired a special report on the discovery, which was watched with rapt attention in Okinawa. For a small group of elderly men and women, it was a revelation that brought them to tears. They were the members of the Shuri Daiichi Survivors Association, led by a 62-year-old school principal named Mr. Kenji Tanaka, who had been a boy of 12 huddled in the terrifying darkness of Command Bunker 3. They now had a name for the faceless American soldier who, they realized, had saved their lives. They felt a profound sense of kozuri-jiri, a moral debt that demanded to be repaid, and they began a letter-writing campaign to their government and to the U.S. Embassy, demanding that Technical Sergeant Harlan M. Hayes be honored. This unlikely coalition of academics, aging American GIs, and Okinawan civilians created an unstoppable moral force. In 1999, Senator Richard Lugar of Indiana, Hayes's home state, partnered with Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii, a decorated veteran of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team who understood the brutal calculus of island fighting. They co-sponsored a bill demanding a formal review of Hayes's court-martial. Dr. Evelyn Reed found herself testifying before a congressional subcommittee on June 6, 2000. In the hushed, wood-paneled hearing room, her voice was steady as she presented the 28 pages of File OSR-DMJ-77B, the meticulous security protocols authored by Colonel Vance, now serving as the very evidence that unraveled the 50-year-old injustice. The quiet rustle of the original documents felt like history itself breathing again. Finally, in 2001, the U.S. Congress passed the Special Act. Harlan Hayes's dishonorable discharge was posthumously changed to honorable, and he was awarded the Navy Cross for his extraordinary moral courage. At a ceremony in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, the medal was presented to his grandnephew, David Hayes. Watching from the front row were two stooped veterans of the 77th Division and a tearful delegation of 5 elderly survivors from Okinawa. Their presence, a living testament to the 877 lives saved, filled the silent hall with the undeniable weight of a conscience that had, half a century earlier, resonated louder than the most terrible weapon of war. The final recognition came on a crisp spring morning, April 12, 2001, 56 years after the fact. In the hushed, hallowed space of the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, Harlan Hayes's grandnephew, a 40-year-old high school history teacher named David Hayes, accepted the posthumously awarded Navy Cross. The air was thick with a heavy, reverent silence as the citation was read, a silence broken only by the quiet sobs of an elderly Okinawan man, Mr. Kenji Tanaka, who had been a boy of 12 in that bunker. Seated beside him were 2 stooped veterans from the 77th Division, Sergeant Bill Jensen and Corporal Mike O'Connell, their faces a complex mask of pride and ancient grief. The medal, resting in its velvet box, felt impossibly heavy, a small, tangible anchor for the weight of 877 lives and the immense, silent sacrifice of a single soldier's honor. The historical re-evaluation was seismic, permanently altering the narrative of the war's end. Dr. Evelyn Reed's 1999 book, The Resonance of Conscience, became required reading at West Point and the U.S. Naval Academy, forcing a new generation of officers to grapple with the story. History books were rewritten to include not one, but two American superweapon programs running concurrently in 1945. The revelation also unlocked a major Cold War mystery. A subsequent declassification of Navy files in 2005 confirmed that the Mjolnir transducer technology, repurposed under Project Orca into the AN/SQS-4 sonar system, had given the U.S. Navy a nearly 30-year acoustic advantage over the Soviet submarine fleet. The quiet work of Dr. Alistair Finch, initially intended for destruction, had secretly become one of America's most critical Cold War assets, a technological ghost whose true origins were born from an act of battlefield mercy. Today, the site of Command Bunker 3 is a place of profound peace. It is the quiet, green heart of the Okinawa Peace Memorial Park, a landscape of manicured lawns and Ryukyu pine trees, where the only sound is the whisper of the Pacific wind. On June 23, 2003, Okinawa Memorial Day, a simple, unadorned black granite stone was dedicated just 150 meters from the bunker's sealed entrance. The inscription, written in both Japanese and English, makes no mention of weapons or soldiers. It simply reads, "On this spot, May 25, 1945, the silent voice of conscience saved 877 lives." Every year, schoolchildren leave thousands of colorful paper cranes at its base, a vibrant tribute to an act of courage they will never fully know, the air smelling of salt and flowers where it once reeked of cordite and fear. The other principal figures met quieter ends. Dr. Alistair Finch died in 1988, having taken the secret of Mjolnir's origins to his grave, a man celebrated for his contributions to naval defense, but privately haunted by his weapon's first terrible purpose. Colonel Sterling Vance passed away in 1992, a paragon of duty whose sealed personal records revealed nothing. The perfect keeper of secrets left behind only silence. But Dr. Evelyn Reed, the historian who broke that silence, received the National Humanities Medal from President George W. Bush in a 2008 White House ceremony for her, quote, unwavering pursuit of a hidden truth. On the 65th anniversary of the event, May 25, 2010, David Hayes stood on that Okinawan ridge. In his hand he held his great-uncle's Navy Cross. He looked across the 150 meters of quiet green grass to the bunker entrance, now a concrete scar almost completely overgrown with lush, peaceful vines. He didn't leave the medal at the memorial. Instead, he simply stood where Technical Sergeant Harlan Hayes had stood, the warm Pacific wind whipping the medal's blue and white ribbon against his fingers. He held the cross up, letting the afternoon sun glint off its bronze surface, a silent salute to the man who chose the resonance of his own conscience over the terrible resonance of his weapon.